April 1999. Women are disappearing from a quiet town in Queensland, Australia.
The community wasn't overly concerned by the disappearances because there was nothing we could offer that could link the three disappearances together.
A brazen abduction in broad daylight will change everything and unmask a cold and calculating killer, unable to control his vicious cravings.
The more we dealt with him, I think the more we realised that we were dealing with the epitome of a sexual predator and a serial killer.
Along with police, there are those who chronicle the investigation up close, on film, on paper, and on tape. They are the public's first witness. Through their eyes, they capture our darkest chapters of crime.
What's up, Panic Fam? I'm Hannah, and if it's 2 a.m., the lights are off and the popcorn is gone cold, you know, it's Panic TV time. Welcome. If you survived this, and this, congratulations, all right? Congratulations, but your luck runs out here.
Occupying the northeastern section of Australia, the state of Queensland's coastline stretches for 7,400 kilometers, dotted with hundreds of coastal towns. One of those towns is Rockhampton, a working-class community situated 40 kilometers inland on the banks of the Fitzroy River.
Rockhampton in the late 90s was a city of about 60,000, a fairly quiet city.
It was one of those places where the kids used to ride their bikes to school, and the parents used to drop their kids at sporting events and that sort of thing and not think twice that they'd be safe.
August 31st, 1998. Jenny Ryan drops her 14-year-old daughter, Natasha, in front of her North Rockhampton High School.
There was evidence of some minor drug use by Natasha. She was unhappy at school, so yeah, she was a troubled teenager back then.
When Jenny Ryan returns to pick up her daughter after school, Natasha is not there. When the teenager fails to return home, her mother contacts Rockhampton police. Fearing that she has run away again, police question her boyfriend, Scott Black, who was questioned for harboring her on a previous occasion. Christmas comes and goes, and by Boxing Day 1998, hope for Natasha Ryan is fading.
As the investigation went on and police became aware that the likelihood of her being alive was very minimal, I think her parents became aware then that foul play had probably struck Natasha.
December 27th, 1998, 10 p.m. 39-year-old Julie Turner enters the Airport Liberties nightclub in downtown Rockhampton.
She was in an abusive relationship, and like he'd kick her out or she'd leave, and then she'd go out into town and go and sing karaoke and things, and she liked to be around people.
Julie Turner leaves the club at approximately 2 in the morning. A few days later, Julie's daughter Kylie gets an unexpected phone call from her mother's boyfriend, Michael McConaughey.
We didn't really get along. The only reason why he rang me was to find out whether Mum was with me or what she was doing, but I didn't know. And I rang him the next day and he still hadn't heard from her.
There were fears held for Julie's welfare. None of her friends had heard from her, including her daughter. She'd failed to attend work.
Detectives also discover that in the days leading to her disappearance, she was planning to leave her boyfriend, 𝐂𝐫𝐸𝐿.
She had informed several of her friends that the relationship was definitely coming to an end, and she was looking for ways of moving out of the relationship and how she could relocate with someone else in the Rockhampton area.
𝐂𝐫𝐸𝐿 denies any involvement in her disappearance.
But in the end, I just knew something was really wrong because she wouldn't ring me. It's just not Mum not to call me.
By the end of February 1999, Julie Turner has been missing for 2 months, Natasha Ryan for half a year.
There was no immediate nexus between Natasha's disappearance and Julie's disappearance, so they were still being examined in isolation, those two cases.
March 2nd, 1999. A young woman turns in a brown handbag found on the muddy banks of the Fitzroy River. It belongs to 36-year-old Beverly Lego. Beverly's landlord has not seen her for several days and reported her missing the day before the handbag was discovered.
At the time, she'd been living in the Mount Morgan area, which was a very lower socio-economic type area outside of Rockhampton. There was evidence that Beverly had sort of dabbled in some illicit drug use in the term leading up to her disappearance.
Beverly's parents are certain that something terrible has happened to their daughter. They believe that the man responsible is her abusive ex-boyfriend, an ex-con named Richard Glitt. Glitt admits that their relationship was an explosive one, but claims that he has not seen Beverly since their breakup 5 weeks earlier. As their search continues, police start to consider the possibility that the 3 missing women are somehow connected.
At that particular time, there were lines of inquiry being conducted separately, but there was officers that were placed in a sort of a management role that were privy to information in all of the operations, basically looking at common threads between the investigation.
By April, however, investigations into the 3 disappearances have stalled. Surveillance on the main suspects in each case, Scott Black, 𝐂𝐫𝐸𝐿, and Richard Glitt, have failed to uncover any concrete leads. Thursday morning, April 22nd, 1999. Teresa Steinhart drops her daughter Keira in front of her North Rockhampton primary school.
Keira was a 9-year-old schoolgirl who lived with her mother and stepfather in a house at North Rockhampton. Her mother describes her as a very forthright and cheeky young girl, but one who was at the same time well-mannered but knew what she wanted and just enjoyed life.
Since her 9th birthday 10 days ago, Keira's parents have allowed her to walk home after school, but only if she promises to go straight home and not talk to strangers.
She said goodbye to her mother that morning, her mother expecting her to see her in a few hours' time, and was never to see her again.
April 22nd, 1999. The search continues for 3 women who have disappeared from the quiet Australian city of Rockhampton, Queensland. At 3:15 that afternoon, 9-year-old Keira Steinhart walks home from her North Rockhampton Elementary School. She decides to take a shortcut through a vacant lot overgrown with trees and grass. 4:13 p.m. Rockhampton police receive an anonymous phone call from a woman who says that a man has just attacked a child in the vacant lot across the street. Minutes later, detectives arrive at the scene, the wooded area adjacent to North Rockhampton High School. A woman tells police that she and her family witnessed the attack from their front porch directly across the street.
A man whom they had seen the previous day and shortly before the attack, as he walked past their house, was seen to come up behind a young girl in a school uniform, strike her from behind, run off the allotment and across the street, down from their house and drive a red car into the allotment, put something into the boot of the car and drive off.
The people across the road were watching all this but had not intervened, and you can't help but think that if they'd called out, her attacker would have stopped and would have run off.
We went back into the spare allotment, and it was at that point that we found hair, blood, tyre impressions from the vehicle that had driven in, and also footprint impressions from the offender himself.
Her shoe was located, her school bag, and there certainly was definitive evidence to identify that that missing child was, or that child that had been attacked there was in fact Keira Steinhart.
Although they wait a full 20 minutes before calling the police, the family does provide a description of the assailant and his car.
They were able to give a description, a physical description of the offender, including clothing, distinctive yellow shorts and a white T-shirt, an older model red sedan, general sort of athleticism of the offender, hair colour, etc.
As detectives contact Keira's parents with the news of her abduction, the crime scene is cordoned off, and the media is alerted not only to report the crime, but to help in its investigation.
And a decision was made to release to the media certain details, including the fact that there'd been an abduction of a 9-year-old girl, the general description of the offender and the vehicle, and where the incident occurred.
We interviewed the local police. They asked the community for assistance. At that stage, we weren't really sure of her condition or what had happened to her.
We went to the crime scene later on and took shots of the police searching and the SES people and searching the vacant block meticulously, you know, going over it inch by inch. I think most crime scenes are not a pleasant place to be at, but covering a crime scene like this one, where you've got a young 9-year-old girl just walking home from school, you know, attacked like that, I think really strikes at your heart.
The community is also outraged by the family that witnessed the event and by their reluctance to act. Their eyewitness description, however, is vital to the case.
A person came forward who happened to be a correctional officer from the prison, and he actually attended the scene on his way to work after seeing the media release at around 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and actually told us that he believed he knew who the offender was. He was actually collecting his own child from school and had driven up that street and can recall seeing a person who had spent time in prison for rape offences. He could confirm to us that that person was wearing clothing described by the family.
The witness gives police a name: Leonard John Fraser.
Leonard John Fraser was a 49-year-old male who'd been in and out of correctional facilities for the majority of his life.
A check with motor vehicles comes up empty, but the name Leonard Fraser corresponds to a Rockhampton address registered on the local domestic violence database.
We sent detectives out there straight away, and they were able to confirm that parked in the driveway was a small red vehicle similar to that described by the family earlier that day. And it was from that point on that we commenced talking to Leonard Fraser about the abduction of Keira Steinhart. He was a very scary person. He was big and he just had that look in his eye. To me, he looked evil.
The detectives ask Fraser and his live-in girlfriend, Keira Steinhart, to accompany them to Rockhampton Police Station for questioning.
Keira Steinhart was a young, intellectually disadvantaged girl who was in a de facto relationship with Fraser at that particular time. Given Fraser's past and the observations of the correctional officer, they were very confident that Fraser had been the offender seen at the scene where Keira met her fate. They were very confident.
With Fraser in custody, detectives and forensics now have 2 crime scenes to investigate.
Now, we had a preliminary crime scene at the scene where Keira had been assaulted and abducted. We then had a secondary crime scene, which was Fraser's unit and his vehicle, so we had to secure that.
They use a myriad of tools to assist them, light enhancement techniques to actually identify possible areas for blood staining. Then samples are then recorded or swabbed for later DNA examination back in the lab.
Forensic investigators find pieces of dried grass in the trunk, along with a black shoelace, several strands of hair, and traces of blood.
There was distinctive areas of blood staining located within the boot of the vehicle, and there was also areas of blood staining located within the cabin of the vehicle.
The suspect's initial response is to blame someone named Squeaky, who he claims borrowed the car earlier that afternoon. Fraser's girlfriend, Keira Steinhart, has a different story.
Shortly before the attack, Leonard Fraser and his girlfriend had been visiting an acquaintance only a few minutes' drive from the allotment where the attack took place. He left there at about 3:10 p.m.
Fraser does not return for nearly 2 hours and has changed out of the yellow shorts and white t-shirt he has been wearing for the last several days. When they leave, Fraser takes Chrissy to a wooded area down by the river.
She then described that he went to the trunk of the vehicle and opened that and took something from the trunk, and she looked out the vehicle and could see what she described to police as a big doll dressed in yellow shirt, green skirt with blonde hair, which was the description of the clothing that Keira was wearing at school that day. It was at that point that Lenny looked back and saw her looking. He dropped the doll and came to the car and punched Chrissy a number of times and told her that if she looked back again that he was going to kill her. And she never looked out the window again.
Raitt tells police that Fraser then disappeared into the bush, returning empty-handed.
I swear my neighbors think I'm probably getting murdered right now.
Day, August 23rd, 1999, Leonard Fraser is formally charged with the abduction of Keira Steinhart. That same day, 2 workmen enter the Queensland Hotel in downtown Rockhampton. The once prestigious landmark has been earmarked for demolition, and the men are here to cost the project.
The Queensland Hotel was a common haunt of vagrant people, homeless types.
At the moment, the old hotel is deserted. But when the workmen enter one of the derelict rooms, it is clear that someone has been here, and someone has died. April 23rd, 1999. In the Queensland city of Rockhampton, Australia, 3 women are missing, as well as a young girl. A violent ex-con named Leonard Fraser is charged with the young girl's abduction. That same day, Rockhampton police are visited by 2 workmen who reported a grisly discovery in room 13 of the Queensland Hotel, a condemned building slated for demolition.
The entire wall was covered in blood that had been actually wiped in some form. and there were blood splatters all over the ceiling and all over the other walls, and a big patch of blood on the carpet at the base of where that wall was.
On the blood splatter and the cast-off blood, you had the picture of someone with extreme force using some sort of weapon, probably a piece of wood, and as they're swinging back, they're casting off the blood around the room. It was a very violent assault.
A trail of blood leads to the room next door, as well as down the stairs to the main floor.
There was other evidence of large blood loss within the toilets of the hotel as well. But the DNA processing takes some time. Initially, there was no idea who had been the source of the blood at that crime scene.
In an attempt to tie a victim to the crime scene, police consider the possibility that Fraser might have murdered Keira Steinhart there, but timelines already established by witnesses make that impossible. And the crime scene is too recent to involve other missing persons cases, including Natasha Ryan, Julie Turner, and Beverly Lego. Meanwhile, the search for Keira Steinhart continues, bolstered by support from emergency services and the community.
The search itself was enormous, and the community support we got with that search from a policing perspective, I have never seen anything like it. But I think realistically, from a policing point of view, after 24 hours, you realise that it's a murder investigation, it's not an abduction.
I remember that across the river here, there was a helicopter searching for Keira's body, and that sound of the helicopter knowing what it was doing, searching for her body, really sent shivers down my spine.
3 days after Keira Steinhart's disappearance, a young man approaches two detectives investigating the case. 𝙀𝙧𝙀𝙧 tells them that his girlfriend, 19-year-old Sylvia Benedetti, is missing.
She was a young girl who was a bit of a street wanderer in and around Rockhampton, also into the drug scene, but very out of character for her to go any more than a day or two without contacting her boyfriend or friends that she knew. And at that point, she hadn't contacted anyone for over a week.
The last she was seen was around 6:30, 7 o'clock at night, sitting in the mall, talking to a man.
𝙀𝙧𝙀𝙧 tells police that the man is Leonard Fraser.
Alarm bells did start to ring. Here we now have a fourth girl missing in the Rockhampton CBD.
Police track down the source of the information, an acquaintance of Doherty's, who confirms that he saw Sylvia and Fraser together and recognized Fraser as a fellow inmate. Throughout their investigation, police have been searching for a common thread that connects the missing women from Rockhampton. Now, they wonder if that thread is Leonard Fraser.
One thing that police told me that he'd said was when they were investigating the Keira Steinhart murder, he said to them, "You're not looking for one body, you're looking for 5.
On April 26th, detectives show Chrissy Raitt a photograph of Sylvia Benedetti.
She was able to identify that Sylvia was a person who had associated with both her and Lenny Fraser, and that I believe Sylvia had even been to their unit where her and Lenny lived.
Police then discover that Leonard Fraser worked at the same meat processing plant as Julie Turner.
She said she was thinking about moving out of where she was at and sharing a place with a guy. She said Lenny.
Police also learn that Beverly Lego's former common-law partner, Richard Gritt, served time with Fraser in the same correctional facility.
Beverly Lego lived across the road from Fraser in Mount Morgan. They were actually neighbours.
Later that same week, Jenny Ryan picks Fraser's mugshot from a group of photographs, recognizing him as a man who frequented the same bowling lanes as her daughter, Natasha.
Fraser, in fact, would transport some of Natasha Ryan's team to the bowling alley and Natasha's mother would drive them home.
Connecting Fraser to 4 missing women is a definite breakthrough, but there are no similar breaks in the search for Keira Steinhart. The investigation is still in its first week when police are approached by Brett Bignell, a small-time crook who first met Fraser in jail 8 years earlier.
Bignell offered to actually engage Fraser in conversation within the cells in the Rockhampton area to try and elicit from Fraser the whereabouts of Keira Steinhart. That plan was put into action and it was electronically recorded.
It was during that time that Lenny Fraser asked him to get rid of something for him from his house that was hidden in a peg box in the garage, and he told Brett that it was a knife. And he said to Brett that if the police find this, I'm gone.
It was actually recovered from the block of flats where Fraser resided. There were obvious areas of blood staining found on that particular knife.
On May 5th, 1999, results come back from the forensics lab on blood samples taken from the knife and Fraser's car. They belong to Keira Steinhart. A podiatrist examines plaster casts of the footprints taken from the vacant lot and confirms that they belong to Leonard Fraser.
He was able to tell us that the offender has a very distinctive foot in that one part of his foot, which is his little toe, doesn't touch the ground when he walks or runs. And the impressions that we took from the offender's feet themselves were able to be positively identified as the same as the impressions that we'd obtained from the track where the offence had taken place.
With the evidence stacked against him, Fraser agrees to help police locate Keira's body in the Rockhampton bushland, but denies that he has any memory of his actions.
He declined to go too close to Keira's final resting place, but he identified the general location without making any substantial comment, and a short distance away they found Keira's body.
Detective Darren Lees must tell Keira's mother the terrible news.
You could actually see the life drain out of her in front of you, in front of your own eyes. Yeah, it wasn't something I'd ever want to relive.
A stricken community shows its support for Keira and her family.
There was thousands and thousands of people from around the Rockhampton community, school children, parents, older people, younger people, just people who wanted to come and pay their last respects to a beautiful girl who didn't deserve to die in the way that she did.
On May 7th, 1999, a charge of murder is added to the abduction charge against Leonard John Fraser. 2 weeks later, forensics confirms that the unidentified blood found in the car and at the Queensland hotel match samples taken from Sylvia Benedetti's clothing.
So immediately, investigators were aware that 2 of the missing females in the Rockhampton area had actually been within Fraser's car and had actually shed blood within Fraser's car.
A full search of that hotel was done and located in an old freezer, down covered in old grotty water, was the clothing belonging to Sylvia Benedetti. Well, I think everybody realised, look, we probably are looking at a serial killer here, and he is probably responsible for the disappearances and death of all these women.
Probably is the key word. Without the victims themselves, it is not entirely certain that Fraser actually killed anyone.
In the absence of a crime scene or a body, it's very difficult to progress suspicious missing person investigations. Obviously, there will always be an element of doubt raised as to, well, is the person just missing or are they in fact murdered?
To answer that question, the investigation will get another important boost from the wrong side of the law. In the Australian city of Rockhampton, Queensland, an ex-convict named Leonard Fraser has been charged with the abduction and murder of a young schoolgirl. Evidence also links him to the disappearance of 𝐂𝐫𝐢𝐦𝐞 𝐒𝐿 and at least 3 other women in the Rockhampton area.
The more we dealt with him, I think the more we realised that we were dealing with the epitome of a sexual predator and a serial killer.
The police, however, need bodies to prove it. While police continue with the investigation, Fraser is transferred to the Moreton B Correctional Centre in Brisbane to await his murder trial.
The Moreton B Correctional Facility was a protective facility. It housed predominantly child sex offenders. It housed some prisoners who had given evidence on behalf of the Crown.
I was at the airport and he was in the back of a police car. I probably would have been no more than a couple of metres from him. But he just had a look on his face that, yeah, he was enjoying the notoriety.
That same notoriety makes Fraser an outcast at the prison and a possible target who needs protection from the mainstream population.
The other inmates may have had pedophile-type backgrounds themselves, but it was different to be in there for the murder of a child. He was the worst of the worst. And it was within this correctional facility that he bumped into a former inmate from New South Wales, one Alan John Quinn.
Alan Quinn is a professional con artist who also needs to be isolated after giving evidence in a Sydney murder case.
Alan Quinn and Fraser had spent some time together in Sydney prisons, in particular Parramatta Jail. Fraser, in an effort to seek out some sort of an ally, he approached Quinn and tried to remind Quinn of their earlier dealings in Parramatta Jail.
July 16th, 1999. John O'Keefe, a detective with the Brisbane Investigations Branch, is contacted by prisoner Alan Quinn.
He had actually charged Quinn with fraud-related offences, that Quinn had told him that Fraser was talking about multiple murders which he had committed in the Rockhampton and 𝐂𝐿𝐴 areas.
Quinn was just terribly affected by the murder of Keira Steinhart, and told me that what he wanted to do was to give something back to the community.
And it was at that point that he started making certain admissions to Alan, and Alan volunteered to police to record the conversations with Lenny over a large period of time.
For the next 4 months, Quinn provides police with a detailed diary of his conversations with Leonard Fraser.
Quinn was able to provide sufficient detail as to the methods of killing and detail of the crime scene, in particular room 13 at the Queensland Hotel, that I was immediately aware that he was talking to the offender or someone who had played some role in at least the Benedetti murder.
In November 1999, Fraser is officially charged with the murder of 𝐂𝐫𝐢𝐦𝐞 Benedetti, based on traces of her blood found in his car and evidence secretly provided by Alan Quinn. On September 7th, 2000, a jury finds Leonard Fraser guilty of the murder of 9-year-old Keira Steinhart.
He didn't seem overly concerned by the verdict. No, I don't think he seemed overly concerned about the pain and the suffering that he'd put Keira's mother and father and brother through, and indeed the Rockhampton community in general.
As well as life imprisonment, I applied for an indefinite term of imprisonment. The effect of the indefinite term of imprisonment was that he could not be released on parole unless he was found no longer to be a danger to the community, which in Fraser's case was highly unlikely.
Not long after Fraser's return to prison, inmate Alan Quinn claims that their conversations have become even more revealing. A special task force is put in place, made up of detectives from the Rockhampton, Queensland, and Brisbane homicide squads. Detective Sergeant David Hickey is put in charge.
It became evident that we needed to actually record these conversations. We did this with the knowledge and the permission of Alan John Quinn. In most graphic detail, Fraser would outline how he abducted, tortured, and eventually murdered the 4 women. And it was all recorded and capable of being played back to a jury in the Supreme Court trial. But he limited his confessions to that. Once again, he didn't want Quinn to think less of him that he had raped and violated these women. So he would invent motives other than sexual for the reasons for assaulting and murdering the women.
Fraser tells Quinn that he stabbed teenager Natasha Ryan after she told him she was pregnant with his child.
Fraser gave a number of stories about Natasha Ryan, but essentially he claimed that he had killed her on a farm outside of Rockhampton and had buried her body on that farm. Fraser told Quinn that he'd killed Beverly Lego out at the Nankin Creek area. He claimed he tied a rope around her neck and that he'd also strangled her. He also told Quinn that he'd actually tossed the handbag into the Fitzroy River to put the police off the trail. With Julie Turner, he told Quinn that as they were driving along, he had simply struck her in the face and the blow had killed her. Well, Fraser eventually told Quinn that Benedetti's skull had been crushed in, that there was blood all over the room, that there was bone in the room, but he said that the police would never find the weapon.
Police do, however, find a body. In late November 2000, surfers discover skeletal remains on a beach trail not far from Rockhampton. Tooth fragments and DNA tests identify 19-year-old Sylvia Benedetti.
Fraser started talking to Quinn because he thought it was to his advantage. He wanted to convince the authorities that he had a mental health illness. He didn't want to spend his time in jail. He wanted to spend it in a mental health hospital.
Quinn suggested, basically, give up the bodies and you might get your wish.
December 21st, 2000. Convicted killer Leonard Fraser leads a convoy of detectives into the Rockhampton countryside.
Quinn had instructed me that Fraser was, in fact, willing to accompany me to Rockhampton and disclose the whereabouts of the bodies. The first location he directed me to was known as Nankin Creek. By that stage, he still was not actually confessing that there would be bodies. He just said that there would be things of interest at these areas that he would take me to. And we subsequently located the skeletal remains of Beverly Lego. And then we continued on to a road which was an area closer to the township of 𝐂𝐫𝐢𝐦𝐞. We walked several hundred metres into this heavily wooded area. There was the skeletal remains of Julie Turner located at this location.
Fraser also leads police to the area where Sylvia Benedetti's remains had already been discovered weeks before. But the search ends here, with Fraser unable or unwilling to disclose where he hid the body of teenager Natasha Ryan.
I could only equate that in my mind that Fraser was happy to disclose the whereabouts of his mature victims, but yet again was somewhat reticent to be linked to the murder of another child.
However, police do have evidence that ties Fraser to Natasha. By his own admission, he knows that she believed she was pregnant. Information never released by the police.
There were other evidence located, physical items of jewellery, which had been seized by police in the possession of Chrissy Raitt. Some of these items of jewellery were positively identified as belonging to Natasha Ryan by Natasha's mother.
detectives have also uncovered evidence in Fraser's taped conversations that tie him to the other women, information that only the killer would know.
If you could slap one character for their dumb decisions, who would it be? Huh? Go on. Vent in the comments. I can't wait to read.
His admissions include knowledge of the Velcro wallet that Julie Turner always carried instead of a purse, and the broken strap on Beverly Lego's handbag tossed into the Fitzroy River.
As a result of those investigations, Fraser was charged with a further 3 counts of murder in relation to adult women. He was also charged with the murder of Natasha Ryan, the young 14-year-old girl who had disappeared in Rockhampton.
The trial is set for March 2003, but the surprises in this case are far from over. March 31st, 2003. The trial of Leonard Fraser for the murder of 4 Rockhampton women gets underway.
The trial of Lenny Fraser was unique in Queensland because it was the first trial of a serial killer in Queensland.
Despite this notoriety, Fraser remains composed, rarely looking at the jury, the media, or his victims' families.
I had to give evidence first during the trial. It was really hard. He just had no emotions on his face. He just sat back and took it all and lapped up all the attention.
Fraser's composure and the court proceedings themselves are about to be shaken by startling news. April 10th, 2003. Detective Daryl Howe arrives at the North Rockhampton home of Natasha Ryan's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance.
He was actually being summoned to give evidence at the Lenny Fraser trial.
Once inside, police begin a search of the premises. Detective Howe notices that he is particularly nervous when they approach one room.
And it was at that point that Daryl opened the cupboard door in one of the bedrooms, and Natasha was crouched down in the cupboard. And she was found alive and well. We spoke to Paul over the telephone and told him what had happened. And obviously he was a bit dumbfounded. I think everybody was, and everyone wanted to make sure that it was Natasha. It had been a number of years since anyone had seen her.
Natasha assures police that it was her decision to stay hidden all these years, and that her boyfriend, Scott Black, had helped her do it.
In a crowded courtroom, I told the court that I'm pleased to inform the court that Leonard John Fraser is not guilty of the murder of Natasha Ryan. Natasha is alive.
Fraser immediately broke down and became emotional. Probably his most telling signs of emotion throughout the entire trial.
In an unprecedented move, Natasha Ryan is called as a witness for the defense. She denies ever meeting Leonard Fraser, despite witnesses who say otherwise.
That put an entirely new character on it, because the trial was running on the basis that we could rely on the admissions that had been made to Quinn by Fraser. Now, obviously, you couldn't rely on any of those admissions because he'd admitted to killing Natasha Ryan, and there she was alive. But what you could rely on is the fact that his admissions showed that he had knowledge of facts that only the killer would know.
The jury agrees and reaches its verdict on May 9th, 2003, after only 1 day of deliberation.
Fraser was eventually found guilty by a jury of 12 as being responsible for the murders of Sylvia Benedetti, the murder of Beverly Lego, and they found him guilty of manslaughter of Julie Turner.
1 month later, Leonard Fraser receives 3 more life sentences, all with indefinite terms.
It was the first time in, I think it was Queensland history, for an indefinite life sentence for just a manslaughter charge.
It is a life sentence that ends suddenly for Leonard Fraser, less than 4 years later, on New Year's Day, 2007.
He died of a heart attack at the Princess Alexandra Hospital in Brisbane. I think he originally had the heart attack on Boxing Day, and he was there until he passed away.
I was in shock. I went into shock for like the whole day. Sometimes I feel like he got out of it easy, and he doesn't have to sit in there every day and think about what he's done. I feel like I've missed most of my kids' young years of growing up for having to deal with it all. I just hope my kids, when they get older, they understand what I've had to do and put up with.
I don't think a family can ever get over that sort of thing, and in particular the brutality of it. I know, for example, Keira's mother and father have split up now. I know for a fact that Rockhampton's changed dramatically since this incident.
Natasha Ryan and Scott Black are fined for provoking an unnecessary police investigation, and Black serves 12 months for perjury. The terrible legacy of Leonard Fraser continues to live on, even after his death.
Fraser was a classic psychopath. He was a violent man, and you just had to look at him, and he looked a violent man. I've got no doubt that Fraser would have killed and killed and killed.
Be honest. Did you watch the last scene through your fingers? Comment yes or no.